based on your experience interacting with many DIY investors, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to successful investing for most people?
I would say the biggest obstacle overall is not being content
Hmm.
with what seems like a simple plan.
Hmm.
And, I have seen this so many times. You put something in front of someone and say, look, this is a simple, easy to execute plan. It's very low cost. It's extremely well diversified, and you should not have any difficulty in maintaining it. You think that you've solved the problem, but, humans are humans. And so even though we say we want simplicity and we just want a path that we can follow, when we're presented with that option, we so often want to complicate things. So we second guess ourselves. We think if it's simple, it must be simplistic, right? I mean, that's always been a problem with index investing, right? If it was this easy, why wouldn't everyone do it? Well, I don't know why everybody doesn't do it. And it's basically the question you just asked, right? It's just behaviorally, we are not really built that way. So the problem is no longer, the industry. The problem is not fees are too high, because all of those problems are easy to get around, right?
Yeah.
The solution is there. The problem now is getting people to understand that it is in fact a solution, and it is in fact something that they can follow. It doesn't need to be complicated. And it's really that kind of emotional and behavioral barrier that has become the only thing standing in the way of investor success now.
But it's also awareness too, right? Like our industry makes a lot of margin off of active high fee products. So it's more than just the availability.
Yeah, it's true for sure. I mean, we will often talk to prospective clients who, most people, as you can imagine, who come to us have already been reading what we've been putting out for
Yeah.
years, and they already get it, right?
Yes.
But sometimes you get a referral, or sometimes you get somebody who comes to you without really a solid understanding of the investment philosophy. And it's a hard sell sometimes, right? I mean, people, what do you mean you don't pick stocks? What do you mean you don't ask yourself, is now a good time to invest, or should I sit on the sidelines and wait? Like, that's the playbook that they have been reading from for years. And so it often takes a long time to get people to understand that a lot of the things that they have been doing for years, and a lot of things that people have been telling them are important, are not in fact as important as they think. But you're right. I mean, how can you come away from the financial media with any other message, right? Other than investing is about what to buy now, right? And,
What's going to
smart
happen?
investors reposition their portfolio every 6 weeks based on economic forecasts. That's the message they get bombarded with, right? And so it's hard to blame anybody for coming away with any other impression.
Yeah.
How do you suggest people approach the stock bond asset allocation decision?
Yeah, and I mean, that's really one of the most important goals at the beginning of any investment plan, right? Is figuring out that proper asset allocation for you. I've always really liked Larry Swedrow's way of modeling this, which is, he says you need to consider your ability, your willingness, and your need to take risk. And so, your ability is probably the easiest one. It's mostly about your time horizon, right? I mean, if you're saving for a down payment in 2 years, you don't have the same ability to take risk in the equity markets as someone who's going to retire in 30 years. And the need to take risk is also just kind of something that you would compute, right? Like, you have a savings goal, a target of a number you want to hit. You know how much you're putting in every month or every year. And then it's just simply the math of calculating how much return. Do you need a 4% return, or do you need a 9% return to get where you're going? So those are simple enough, I think. But for me, it really comes down to the willingness to take risk as the most important factor, right? Because if you only look at the other two, you could argue that any young investor with a time horizon of 20 years or more should just be 100% stocks. And I have seen that advice from a lot of people, right? And you're told, why are you wasting your time with conservative investments like bonds or GICs? You've got the time horizon to, be all in stocks. And yeah, again, that's true. If you're a robot and you're going to, have a 30-year time horizon where you're never going to look at your portfolio, that's probably true. Most of us are not. And so we've all seen it, right? In working with clients. I mean, lots of people have the ability, right? And the need to take risk, and you've aligned that with their asset allocation. But if you're going to be sick to your stomach every time the market falls 10%, you cannot be an aggressive investor. And a lot of people simply don't know where they are on that spectrum until they have lived it. And that's one of the things that we certainly saw kind of in the years when I started the blog, like around 2009 onwards, right? Markets were very good for a long time. And you had all kinds of people overestimating their risk tolerance. And, I don't know how those people ended up in 2022, for example. So I think that really it comes down to what you can be comfortable with. If you look at your portfolio every day, and you probably shouldn't, but if you do, and it doesn't give you a heart attack every time you've seen it, fall 5, 10, 15, or even 20 or 30%, then sure, be aggressive. But most of us are going to be somewhere on that balanced continuum, right? Somewhere between 30 and 80% stocks, I think, is the vast majority of people.
We're in a weird time now, for people not having had the opportunity to test how they'll respond to a proper bear market, because we had COVID, but it bounced back so fast. It's like, oh, that wasn't so bad.
Yeah.
But it can get worse.
Yeah, it's so true. And it's funny because I really feel like it's not so much the depth of a bear market, it's the length of a bear market that is the bigger test. I wasn't in the market in any meaningful way in during the dot-com crash, but I can imagine, and as an advisor, can you imagine having those meetings with clients? We had 3 consecutive years of negative equity returns. That's tough to take. Right.
Brutal.
I mean, we can all hey, we have a bear market and, it's 3-6 months of misery, but try doing that 3 years in a row. How many people were scared out of the market there for years, maybe forever?
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And then they all missed the huge bear market the huge bull market that followed that before 2008 took it away again. So it's just, I think people don't always appreciate how painful those downturns can be. One of the things we always do when we speak to clients about assessing their risk is we don't talk about percentages, we talk about dollars. It has such a bigger impact, right? So if you have a client, I mean, even with $1 million, and you say, how would you feel if, a 20% decline? And people would say, oh, well, that's a garden variety bear market, right? I'm fine with that. They say, how would you feel if you lost $200,000 next year? Well, that sounds a lot worse, right? Yeah. It's the same question. So if you express it in terms that people can truly appreciate in terms of dollars lost, I think they have a bit more of an appreciation for the effect it might have on them.
Yeah, that's a great point. Can you talk about how, and this is something that your blog went into so much detail in back in the day, like you talked about, when someone's decided on the asset allocation, what actually goes into selecting the ETF or index fund that they should use to express that allocation?
Yeah, again, in the old days that was pretty easy, right? If you wanted to buy a Canadian equity ETF, there was a couple available and they were all pretty similar. Nowadays, you have so many choices within individual asset classes. So I think if you're going to be building a portfolio with individual ETFs now as a do-it-yourselfer, your default choice or your starting point has to be the ETF that has the broadest coverage of that asset class at the lowest cost and with the fewest rules, right? I mean, all index funds have some rules that they have to constrain. They can't just hold everything. But I mean, if you want to use a specific example, let's say something like if you want to invest in US stocks, you've got a lot of choices, but I think for most people, the best choice is going to be a total market index. So it holds something in the order of 3,500 stocks these days. It covers over 99% of the investable public markets in the US. And you can get these funds for, anywhere between 3 and 15 basis points fees, right? So now you bought the entire US market at remarkably low cost. Now you can go a different route. You can buy the Dow Jones index and get 30 stocks, or you can buy the NASDAQ 100 and get 100 mostly tech stocks. And a lot of people are going to look at performance and say, well, this one outperformed that one over the last 5 years, so why wouldn't I get the best performer? But if your goal, again, as an index investor is to kind of buy the broadest market you can, then it doesn't make sense to look for ETFs that filter for a lot of, specific things and end up giving you only a narrow cross section or only a narrow segment of the total market. So then you can apply that to the other asset classes as well. Just if you're buying a Canadian stock ETF, try to get one that covers the most, the broadest coverage of the Canadian market. International stocks, try to get one that covers the broadest market. And that includes, large, mid, and small companies, if you can get all of that in a single ETF. With bonds, same sort of thing, a mix of maturities, a mix of government and corporates. So that to me is really about trying to get the broadest possible coverage at the lowest possible cost, and not imposing your own idiosyncratic rules on what you want to hold and what you don't.
Exactly. I'm guessing a number of listeners remember the old Uber Tuber couch potato portfolio, which was based largely on factor investing. Have your views on it changed since then?
Yeah, there was a time there when I was creating model portfolios that even I fell prey, to this idea that, well, why just present a simple portfolio of 3 or 4 funds, right? There's all kinds of other specific strategies you might want to target. So I had like a high yield portfolio, and the one that I called the Uber Tuber as in the ultimate, index portfolio, broke it down even further. So it had access to kind of small cap and value stocks. And I think it had real estate and that in there. So again, it was kind of an attempt to get even more diversification. And it was also based on, the research being done that's shown that, tilting towards factors like value and small could increase your returns over time. And so I put that one together. I honestly have no idea how many people actually followed it because it was pretty complicated. I believe it was at least 10 ETFs. And, I would say it was kind of a thought experiment. But as I was saying earlier, over the years, I've just come to understand that trying to split hairs like that and trying to, create more complexity in pursuit of higher returns usually ends up, in disappointment. And so, that's not something I would ever recommend anymore. And if you were interested in a portfolio that tilted the factors, there's way more efficient ways of doing it than a portfolio like that.
I've talked to a few people that had implemented the Uber Tuber, so at least 2 maybe.
Okay. So
Yeah.
some of those funds don't even exist anymore.
No.
So yeah, I wonder how it evolved over time.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It has been cool though to see the evolution on the blog of, you alluded to this earlier, trying to optimize a lot of different things and writing about it incredibly. Then it's transitioned over time to simplicity, which is reflected in the blog now.
Yeah, I think that's just, a matter of kind of information and knowledge evolving into wisdom, right? I think they're kind of different things. And I also think that there's very different incentives and motivations when you are a writer versus when you're an advisor. So when I was, doing the blog full time, I was doing 2 blog posts a week, and they were pretty detailed for the most part. It was a lot of work. And when you're writing 2 blog posts a week, you can't write, keep it simple, stay the course, right? That gets boring very quickly. And that explains a lot of the financial media, right? You can't just write that message over and over. It's boring and no one wants to read it. even if it's wise and prudent and all the rest. And then when you're an advisor, so you got a couple of things going on. One, you no longer really care about coming up with new information twice a week. You want to focus on, what you're doing every day. But the other thing is you realize all of these, like your audience as a writer is often unclear to you. Like certainly you get comments and that from people, but when you're actually working with real families, you start to understand this really isn't that important to them, is it? Right? Like if I tried to have some argument with a family that I work with about, some academic study that showed some certain exposure to this or that factor might lead to 20 basis points of higher returns, it doesn't matter to them. It doesn't make any difference in their life. Yeah. So you start to realize, okay, I'm going to focus on the things that actually make a real difference to people. And a lot of that starts to drift away from investing and into planning, right? And I was talking with somebody about this the other day, that we will sometimes have review meetings where, we're having this discussion with a client for 90 minutes. And then at the end of it, it's like, I guess we should talk about the portfolio, eh? And, we go over the, performance and we look at the holdings, but they don't even really, they're not preoccupied with it, right? And that's not to say that we don't care very deeply about returns. Of course we do, but to drill into the nitty gritty of it ends up not really being what most people, I think, get value from the relationship.
Yeah, totally. That's been our experience too. Related to that, can you talk about how important it is to be clear on financial goals before someone starts investing?
That's something we hear all the time and it seems very obvious, but if you talk to a lot of people, especially early on in the process, if you're working with a new client, you start to realize that many people's investing experience is pretty divorced from their goals, right? Or if they have, like when you talk about some, what are your financial goals? And they're things like, well, I want to get a 7% return. So, well, that's not really a goal. I mean, it's kind of a goal, but it's not a life goal, right? And so, you have to push, well, why do you want to get a return like that, right? And so I think it's really important to establish pretty early on in the relationship that, your life goals are what's more important. And your investments are just a tool or a strategy for getting to those goals. So when people when they ask questions about why aren't we doing this or that, you can turn it around and say, well, how does that relate to your goal, right? What is your goal? Is it early retirement? Is it, working later in life, but enjoying more spending, So I think it's really important to be able to define what the goal is, not in terms of a tactic, right? My goal is to invest 40% in US equities. That's not a goal, right? Try to attach it to something meaningful in your life and then figure out your investment strategy is just a way of getting there. And it takes people a little while, I think, to get into that philosophy, but I've certainly found, like with clients, after a couple of years, they start to get that. And more the discussions and the meetings tend to focus on those goals. And they just kind of take for granted that the investment strategy is eventually going to get them there.